Welcome to Cut and Thrust, your podcast for the bloody and sometimes bizarre journey through the Middle Ages. Whether it's dark battles, questionable hygiene, or hair-raising rulers, here you'll get history as it really was, raw and unfiltered. So grab your sword, put on your helmet, and let's dive into the wild world of the past.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Battle Merchant podcast. I'm Hendrik.
And I'm Carmen. Today we're diving into a topic that truly affected everyone in the Middle Ages: headwear.
And I mean really almost everyone. Whether man or woman, peasant or noble, most people simply wouldn't go outside without something on their head. It was just completely uncommon to do so.
And that wasn't just for fashion reasons.
Not at all. First and foremost, it was pure necessity. Imagine living in the 12th century. The streets aren't paved, there's dust and dirt everywhere, plus the weather, rain, wind, blazing sun. A head covering was your first line of defense against all of that.
And then, of course, there were the lice.
Ah yes, the lovely lice.
That was a real everyday problem back then. Without running water, without our modern hygiene options, vermin were simply part of life. A head covering helped protect the hair and at least keep the problem under control.
Today, we often see it as a fashion accessory, but back then it was really
vitally important.
And that applies to all levels of society, though with clear differences.
What do you mean by that?
Just look at the materials. In the countryside, depending on the time and region, people wore googles or hoods, linen coifs, or simple wool and felt caps, usually in natural tones or subtly dyed colors, not just black or grey. Purely functional, no frills. For peasant women, it was often a simple linen kerchief.
While among the nobility, of course, everything looked different. There were various styles depending on the era. In the late Middle Ages, for example, berets made of velvet and silk, adorned with brooches and gold cords. Or those delicate hairnets interwoven with gold and silver threads, sometimes even set with pearls.
The head covering was essentially a kind of, how should I put it?
Calling card?
Yes! At first glance, you knew who you were dealing with. That wasn't coincidence, it was by design.
But for women, there was a whole other dimension to it. This issue of propriety.
Right, and that's really interesting. For married women, covering their hair wasn't just practical, it was socially expected. A married woman's loose hair in public, that was almost scandalous.
Hair was considered something
intimate, private. Only the husband was supposed to see it. That might sound strange today, but it was deeply rooted in medieval society.
Unmarried girls, on the other hand, were often allowed to wear their hair loose. That also signaled they were still available. So the head covering also indicated marital status.
A completely different concept from today, where we have a ring for that.
And were there regional differences? Europe is pretty big.
The specific forms and styles varied greatly. What was fashionable in France looked different in Germany. But the basic principle, married women cover their hair, that was widespread throughout Christian Europe, though with differences in how strictly it was enforced.
So a truly cross-cultural phenomenon.
And within this tradition, there were various wrapping techniques and styles. One of them, which was particularly elegant and practical, is the so-called wimple.
That one is really special, because it was so versatile.
The wimple is actually a multi-part head covering made of white linen or silk that conceals the hair and part of the face. And it was popular for centuries. In Germany, it's actually documented for married women as early as the 9th century, then really became widespread from the 12th to the 15th century.
That's an amazingly long time span for a single garment.
There are good reasons for that. And those are exactly what we are going to take a closer look at now.
And this multi-part construction has, as you've already hinted, A very special way of being worn.
What's special is this particular way of wearing it. There was often a chin band called a barbette or a fillet. The barbette was especially common in the 14th and 15th centuries. Then a veil over that. The parts were often secured with pins. It looked different depending on the region and time period.
And that was in use over a remarkably long period. As I said, a good 600 years of tradition, though its heyday was in the late Middle Ages.
What did change, though, was the wrapping method. That evolved over the centuries.
But the basic principle stayed the same, and the wimple was particularly common in one context, among nuns. It was an integral part of the nun's habit.
Which makes sense. The wimple was considered particularly modest. The hair was completely hidden. The neck was covered too. It fit perfectly with monastic life.
Though, of course, it wasn't only worn by nuns. Secular women, especially married ones, also used the wimple regularly. It was often combined with an additional veil.
In medieval depictions, you can see
exactly this combination. The wimple as the base, with a fine veil over it. That gave the whole thing even more elegance.
But now here's the point that really impressed me. Although the multi-part system was often secured with pins, the actual wimple can also work without them.
You mean the thing about the pins?
Exactly. For a wimple, you often don't need pins. If it's wrapped properly, it can hold on its own. Historically, many women did still use pins for extra security, though.
That might not sound so spectacular to us today, but in the Middle Ages, that was a real advantage. Pins back then were made of brass or iron, each one handcrafted individually. That made them expensive.
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that. Pins as a cost factor.
From the 14th century onward, pins were produced in larger quantities, but everything was still handmade. Real mass production didn't come until 1785, and every single eye needle required up to 110 manual steps. That's why they were so valuable. A head covering that could do without them was genuinely practical.
And it's not just the price. Pins can come loose. You can prick yourself. With the wimple, you wrap it once in the morning and you're done. At most, you might need to adjust it a bit throughout the day.
Other coifs often needed several
pins to secure them. That's right. The wimple was really, what's the word? Low maintenance?
That's exactly it.
And what was the typical material for a wimple like this?
Mainly linen. That was the standard, especially for the common folk and, of course, in the monasteries. Fine, often bleached linen.
And for the wealthier women?
Silk. That was already a status symbol. But the basic principle was the same. Light, flowing fabrics that wrap well and still hold their shape.
Interesting how that ties back into the theme of social distinctions. Even with a head covering that in principle anyone could wear.
The material revealed one's status, but the function was the same. And the beautiful thing about the wimple is that it really worked for any woman, whether peasant or noblewoman, whether nun or townswoman.
The question now, of course, is, how do you actually wrap one of these things?
It's actually not as complicated as it looks. Once you get the hang of it, it becomes almost automatic.
Then let's go through the practical steps. Now it gets really interesting, because the wimple isn't purely a, let's say, Christian medieval invention.
You mean the thing about the Vikings?
Right, that's what I mean. Textile finds from Birka and Oseberg show that Scandinavian women wore kerchiefs and veils, often secured with hairpins. But how they were wrapped, we don't know. The textile remains are too fragmentary. And whether there's really a direct line to the wimple, there's a good 100 years between them, so that remains speculative.
I wouldn't have expected that. Vikings and nuns with possibly similar head coverings?
Sounds paradoxical at first, doesn't it? But when you think about it, it makes sense. Practical problems, practical solutions. The weather in Scandinavia was harsh. Women needed protection for their head and hair, and a wrapped cloth without complicated fastening was simply efficient.
And among Viking women, covered hair was also considered a sign of respectability. Married women didn't wear their hair loose. That's remarkably similar across cultures.
What's archaeologically fascinating, while we have few preserved textile remains of head coverings, from Birka, that famous Swedish trading center, we know of dress pins that primarily held linen garments together. The kerchief interpretation is a hypothesis, but not confirmed.
And the materials?
Wool and linen, like most textiles of the Viking Age. Wealthier women showed their status more through elaborate fibula or brocaded trimmings, like those we know from Birka. The metal diadems some people imagine existed in the Bronze Age, not among the Vikings. But the basic principle, a simple cloth, skillfully wrapped, that was accessible to everyone.
That's the beauty of it. Whether a Viking woman in the north or a townswoman in the Frankish realm, the practical solution was similar.
And then the Normans come into play too. They were in the 10th
and 11th century?
Right, thanks. The Normans were basically Christianized descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France. Then, in 1066, they conquered England under William the Conqueror.
So, a direct cultural connection. Vikings become Normans. Normans bring many things to England and southern Italy, though when it came to fashion, it developed interestingly.
And with that, their practical everyday solutions. Head coverings were part of that, though Norman women adapted quite quickly to Frankish Western European fashion, meaning veils over face and neck rather than Scandinavian wrapping techniques.
What fascinates me about this, it's not coincidence and not necessarily direct copying. Sometimes different cultures simply develop parallel solutions to similar problems.
The technical term for that is convergent development. You have a practical problem, protect your hair, appear modest, don't waste expensive materials, and different cultures arrive at similar answers.
Were there regional differences within Europe?
Certainly. The exact wrapping style, the length of the cloth, how much of the face was covered, that varied. In the Mediterranean region, the cloths were often lighter. In Scandinavia, thicker against the cold. But the principle remained.
And depending on what you were
doing, absolutely. When working in the fields, it was wrapped tighter and more practically. For representative occasions, you could use more fabric, drape it more elegantly, maybe add a veil on top.
So a head covering that adapts to the situation. Compact in the morning during work, more elaborate at a feast in the evening.
And all without changing the form. Just the wrapping, the tension, the amount of visible fabric. That's really clever design.
In reenactment today, you can see that too. Depending on the era and region being portrayed, there are different wrapping variations. Scandinavian portrayals wrap differently than high medieval German ones.
Have you tried it yourself?
Several times. And it's really true. Once you get the hang of it, it's surprisingly versatile. One cloth, but completely different looks depending on how you wrap it.
What impresses me about it is the possible connection across centuries. Whether Viking women in the 9th century wrapped similarly to monastic communities later. We don't know for sure, but the practical requirements were the same everywhere.
Because it works, that's the point. What works well catches on, whether among nuns or among Viking women.
And that's exactly what makes the wimple so interesting. It's not just a garment, but an example of how practical solutions transcend cultural boundaries.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Feeling curious? Then head over to battlemerchant.com. They've got all sorts of medieval stuff, from costumes to armor and loads more. Totally worth a look.
That brings us to the question we raised earlier. How do you actually wrap a wimple in practice?
There's a clear step-by-step guide for that. Let's go through it.
So, on to the practical side. First things first, the size of the cloth.
For modern reproductions, around 180 by 50 centimeters, right?
That's the recommended minimum size. Any shorter and it practically won't work, because you won't have enough material to wrap the cloth properly around your head and chin. The end that's supposed to hang out at the side needs some length too.
Wider than 50 centimeters can work, but then usually gets bulky.
That's true. 50 centimeters is ideal, because you can cover the forehead and chin well without the fabric bunching up. The basic principle is the cloth is wrapped around the head and passed under the chin. And at the end, one end hangs out to the side.
That sounds simple at first, but I imagine it's not that easy in the beginning.
It isn't. The first few times you sit there wondering why the thing won't stay in place or why it looks so odd. That's completely normal. You start at the back of the head, bring the cloth forward, and then comes the crucial part. You have to twist one side.
Twisting means?
That you twist the fabric before continuing. That gives the whole thing hold and ensures the wimple doesn't just come undone. Without this twist, everything slips.
And then?
Then you bring the twisted side up behind the head, lay part of it across the forehead, while the other side runs along under the chin. Then you switch the ends once, so what was at the chin goes up and vice versa.
And then it holds on its own, without pins?
Surprisingly, yes. If the wrapping is right, it holds all day. The twisting creates enough friction and tension.
That's really cleverly designed.
Although there's a balance between wrapping tight and loose. If you wrap too tight, it might become uncomfortable after a while. Too loose, and you'd have to readjust it more often throughout the day. Better to start a bit tighter. Having to readjust is annoying, and at the beginning you haven't figured out how tight is really tight enough. Over time, you develop a feel for what works best for you personally.
And which fabrics work best?
Linen is ideal because
That was also the historically authentic material.
And for good reasons. Linen has this slight grip to it. It doesn't slide as easily as silk, for example. Cotton works too. It's softer and more practical for beginners. But historically, it was hardly available here. So for authenticity, go with linen. It also has this natural hold to it, you could say.
What are typical mistakes people make at the beginning?
The most common one? Letting go of the cloth too soon. You think it's in place, and then everything falls apart. It's better to really secure each step before moving on. And many people forget the twist, or don't do it firmly enough.
Do you have a tip for how best to practice?
In front of a mirror. That's really the best advice. Without a mirror, you can't see what you're doing and it's frustrating. With a mirror, you can check each step And if someone who already knows how is there with you, even better. Then they can correct you before mistakes become habits.
Practice makes perfect.
Absolutely. The first 3 or 4 attempts will be wobbly. That's normal. But then comes that moment when suddenly everything sits right and you think, so that's how it works.
And from then on, it gets easier every time.
Exactly. Eventually, you do it in the morning without thinking. And then you can start experimenting. Tighter or looser, more fabric visible or less, with a veil over it or without.
So the wimple isn't just a historical head covering, but still practically applicable today.
That's the beauty of it. It works just as well as it did 600 years ago.
So the wimple is far more than just a piece of fabric. It's an authentic element of medieval everyday culture.
And that's what makes it so valuable for anyone involved in historical portrayals. Whether at a medieval fair, reenactment, or larp, a head covering is what really completes the garb.
What I particularly like about it, you can portray different roles and eras with the wimple. A wrapping for a peasant woman in the 10th century looks different than for a townswoman in the 14th.
The wrapping style did change over the centuries. Early medieval was more simple and practical, later more elaborate and representative. That gives you a lot of flexibility.
And combining it with other elements?
That's where it gets really interesting. The wimple was often worn together with a veil. You can see that in many medieval depictions. The wimple as the base, with a fine veil over it for that elegant, flowing look.
And for wealthier portrayals, you can add head jewelry, circlets, brooches, decorated pins on the veil.
Though the wimple itself can work without pins, even if historically many women used them for extra security. For beginners today, that's practical.
The perfect starting point for anyone who wants to try their hand at medieval headwear.
Absolutely. And my advice to everyone who wants to give it a try? Just start. Perfectionism only holds you back. The first attempts won't be perfect, and that's completely fine.
There are also other wrapping variations that...
Yes, the wimple is just one of many options. There are simpler kerchief ties, there are coifs, there are veils, a whole universe of headwear.
The nice thing is, once you've found your entry point, more and more possibilities open up. You start with the wimple and then maybe discover other styles you like even better.
Or you stick with the wimple and vary it. Looser for every day at the market, more elegant for a banquet. One cloth, endless looks.
What would you recommend to someone going to a medieval fair for the first time?
Don't try to do too much at once. Good basic garb, plus a wimple, that's perfectly enough to start with. Better to have a few elements that fit well than too much that doesn't go together.
And don't drive yourself crazy with questions about historical accuracy. Of course, authenticity is nice, but ultimately it's about having fun and experiencing history.
That's an important point. The portrayal has to suit you. Some people want it 100% historically accurate. Others place more emphasis on comfort and aesthetics. Both are valid.
Anyone who wants to delve deeper will also find other kerchief variations, coifs,
and much more on the Battle Merchant blog. There you'll find more tutorials and background information on medieval clothing.
and of course the right cloth to go with it.
Yes, that certainly makes getting started easier.
So then, grab a cloth and give it a try.
I hope we were able to give you a good overview of the wimple. From its practical origins through the cultural connections to its practical application today.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to check out battlemerchants.com. There you'll find not only the right materials, but also many more fascinating topics about history and historical garb on the blog.
Until next time.
Take care.
And so we ride towards the end of this episode. Keep your sword sharp and your mugs full. We'll catch you in the next one.